Now, he's got some documents that he's going to share with us as well that I can get to you through that link.
All right, I'll set this up so Josh can share the screen then too.
All right. Well, I thought that it was important that we talk about the election, even though it was pretty important that we not talk about it in a partisan way. So I went to the MSU history or the Political Science Department website, and I saw a couple of names of people who are pretty well associated with a certain point of view. So I was happy when Jamil said that that Josh was a good choice for this presentation, and I'm very happy that he has chosen populism in the 21st century as his topic, because I think it's something that we are all seeing in this election and on both sides of both the red and the blue. So it's kind of interesting to hear about that topic. So without any further time, I'm going to pass it to Josh Berkenpas from MSU. If we can all give Josh a warm but silent Kiwanis welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mike, for reaching out to me, and thanks to the club for inviting me to speak today. Josh Berkenpas, professor of political science in the Department of Government at MSU. This is I'll be starting my 5th winter, as Jamil said, this year. And I teach courses in American politics and in political theory. And this topic, here, let me just go ahead and share. I came up with an outline of sorts. Yes, that looks good. All right, so hopefully you can all see my outline here with my information. The talk, Populism in the 21st Century. You can see my contact information there at the top of the page. I'll try and leave some time for questions here at the end. Very interested to hear your thoughts and reactions to this idea of populism, particularly as it relates to the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency, and now the new campaign in 2020. So feel free to reach out to me. Email is there, josh.berkenpas at mnsu.edu. All right, so this is part of a larger project. I began when I organized a faculty panel in 2018 on the fate of liberal democracy. And at this time, and it's continuing to this day, lots and lots of ink is being spilt, so to speak, on the topic of a crisis in liberal democracy. We see all these populist movements, populist leaders being elected in countries around the world, different ways of measuring populism. So anywhere from 20 to 40 world leaders, notably the US, the UK, Hungary, and other places, right, have recently elected populist leaders to the highest office of the land, either the president or the prime minister. So we're seeing it in the United States, but this is also very much a global phenomenon, and I'll touch base on and why that might be the case today as well. So I want to start off talking about populism in the US in the 2016 election. Some features of populism, sort of the big idea, is that it's a social movement, right? Not unlike the civil rights movement or Black Lives Matters today or the Me Too movement, right? Lots and lots of people coming together in order to promote goals they share in common, right? In this case, the sort of broad idea is that something is wrong with the political system and we need to fix it, right? As we'll see in a little bit, the US political system has its challenges today, right? And populism as a movement is a way of signaling that large portions of the population are dissatisfied with the status quo in the US political system. Certainly the Trump campaign drew on populist sentiment in the US population, drew on it and did so in an effective way, and managed to win the election, right? Not the popular vote, but did win the Electoral College. So we can go back, the history of Minnesota has a strong populist and progressive history, 19th century, 20th century populist and progressive movements, fighting for things like anti-corruption, certainly, also trying to end monopolistic policies in the railroads, as well as in the grain mills and things like this. So we've seen waves of populism throughout US history, and this is the latest one. In the past, as I'll touch on again here in a moment, those populist waves have more or less been incorporated by the major parties, right? They say, oh, all right, that plank seems to be working, that policy idea seems to be working, seems to be generating interest among the population. Let's incorporate that into our own platform, right? So the Republicans or the Democrats incorporate and then come out with things like, the New Deal or something like that to try to quell populist sentiment in the US. And that has worked in the past, right? Populism subsides. We go back to a sense of normalcy in American politics. The two-party system remains relatively stable, and the liberal democratic regime continues on, for better or worse. Also point out as my second bullet point, and John mentioned in the introduction, or perhaps it was Mike, that populism exists on the left and the right. All right, so in political science, we talk about political ideologies on a spectrum from the left to the right. It's fairly common language these days, particularly in the media. But it's important to remember that populism exists on both the left and the right. In the primary we just had, of course, President Trump representing populism on the right. On the left, we had a number of candidates who were tapping into populist sentiment as well, notably Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and others. Really interesting to me that the Democratic Party coalesced around the sort of mainstream, not necessarily non-populist, but not overtly populist candidate in Joe Biden. Members of his party are trying to push him in that direction to adopt policies that appeal to a more populist sentiment, but very centrist, right? So at one point during the primaries, I was talking about, we might have two populist candidates up for election in 2020, one on the right, one on the left. But now it's Trump, Biden, in many ways quite similar to the election of 2016, right? When Clinton ran as a sort of moderate centrist candidate versus the populist Trump candidate. So let's talk real briefly about some of Trump's populist features of Trump's populist coalition in 2016. Things like, and these are common to other populist movements around the world, anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism, an appeal to the common man or common sense, right? And something about expertise and the elites that is off, right? They're self-serving and we shouldn't trust them, all right? And that has all sorts of implications for the type of rhetoric, the appeals that candidates like Donald Trump use to try to gain support. Along those same lines, anti-bigness, as I say here, one of the sort of outcomes of globalization and neoliberal policies over the past several decades has been sort of consolidation of industry across industries in the American economy and the world economy. And this has meant other outcomes such as outsourcing and things like this that has really left behind large portions of the American public, particularly in rural non-urban areas. Other big entities that often get attacked, right? Government, of course, healthcare, banking, and even education, right? Higher education, the university is a popular topic, and of course that also overlaps with anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism. And then we have anti-globalism, free trade, right? I mentioned that. One of the first things President Trump did was to sink an international trade agreement, the what was it, the TPP or something like this, that was all but signed under the Obama administration, and throughout that deal commonly attacks NAFTA as a terrible deal for America and things like this, right? Other common targets, the World Bank, and the pandemic, of course, the World Health Organization, right? That is low-hanging fruit for a populist candidate, right? And then finally, particularly in the Trump campaign, anti-immigration and racist narratives, right? And lots of folks have talked about how in the past we would talk about sort of dog whistles and things like this. It's sort of symbolic racism. You have to sort of be looking for it. And it seems to be becoming more and more overt, right? Particularly in social media, Twitter, the blogosphere, and things like that. All right, so that's populism in general, going back to the 2016 election. We can also talk about the upcoming election in 2020. And drawing on an economist and political scientist out of California, Berkeley, Barry Eichengreen. His 2018 book, I think, is a good one to look at if you're interested. The Populist Temptation. Good title as well. And he says that populist movements occur when essentially there is widespread, 1, economic insecurity, 2, perceptions of an unresponsive political system, and 3, feelings of a threat to national identity. We see all those things in 2016, and we're still seeing them today. All right, economic insecurity continues. We have this pandemic, and there's been, everyone's on staying home or unemployed. So we still haven't seen the full effects of that. Seen some reports of gains in jobs, and we're opening back up. So perhaps that will, that will improve soon. But the bigger story goes back to the Great Recession, right, 2008. And after that, we've seen a recovery, but it hasn't been even, right? Those on the upper end of the income scale have recovered quicker. Those on the lower end have still not recovered to the levels that they had in 2008, right? So widespread feeling of being left behind, economic insecurity, jobs being outsourced, and things like this. Perceptions of an unresponsive political system go hand in hand with that, right? There's all sorts of policies out there that the American public would like to see adopted, but for a variety of reasons are not adopted, all right? Part of it has to do with the structure of the US Constitution, the checks and balances, separation of powers, and things like this. It's designed really to frustrate the will of the majority, right? To slow down any sort of landmark legislation and things like this. Part of it too has to do with increasing polarization, both in the electorate and amongst our political leaders, which I'll talk about, or I mention a little further down, which tends to lead to gridlock, right? Legislative gridlock, the inability to come to compromise, negotiate, and things like this. So widespread perception that the political system is broken, it's unresponsive, that elites are only looking out for themselves, and that sort of middle America is being left behind. That is also closely tied to number 3, perceived threats to American national identity, right? What does it mean to be American? And, people who are sort of living in, I suppose, rural America often have quite a different perception of what it means to be American than folks living in urban areas. Certainly different perceptions amongst those who are college educated, right? Who have attained a college degree or gone on to even higher education, often have very different views on what it means to be American, right? And previously dominant groups, I suppose, middle class, white, Christian, English-speaking Americans are quite often feel as though their identities are under threat, that America is changing, it's becoming more pluralistic and diverse. And that is seen as, or can be seen as a threat to themselves personally or to groups that they feel that they belong to, right? And that can be easily tapped into because it has to do with your sense of self, right? Your identity as a person, as a citizen, by these populist movements. So that's that. Populist themes, I've sort of touched on these already, but you'll see lots of appeals to the people. I put the people in quotation marks because, it's a hotly contested concept in social science. It's actually exactly who or what the people entails. And in this context, it often refers to that sort of dominant or previously dominant group, sort of middle America, white Christian folks who feel that their position is under threat in this new, pluralistic, multicultural setting that we find ourselves in. So appeal to the people, and that's the sort of group that feels under threat. A common sense, ordinary Americans, disregard for facts and anti-intellectualism. We see this quite often. Think of the phrase alternative facts, right, that we saw not too long ago, and the questioning of fake news, right, and things like this. It becomes very hard to determine what is true and false, and ultimately in a populist movement, those who are following a populist leader just follow the populist leader for the most part, right? Because nothing is true. You can't determine what's true and false. So the person who's leading the movement that I identify with, must be telling me the quote unquote truth. Right? And then racism, xenophobia, I've touched on both of those, maybe not the xenophobia so much. That's tied to immigration, right? And of course, President Trump has wanted to build a wall. His inaugurate, well, I don't know if you want to call it inauguration, but his announcement for the presidency, running for president, he referred to Mexicans, of course, as rapists and things like this, criminals, like to mention the big gang, MS-19 or something like that, right? And those are all sort of appeals to this idea that, again, people who are not members of the dominant group coming into the United States and diminishing the sort of, I suppose, power and prestige of that group, right? So we have to do something about it. We have to stop immigration. Of course, there's also the Muslim ban on a number of immigration or emigration from a number of countries who had dominant Muslim majority populations. And an exaggerated moralism. We haven't seen too much of this in the United States, I wouldn't say yet. Fingers crossed, because I think if we start to go down that path, things might get a lot darker, a lot quicker. And here, appeals to, again, Christianity, to this idea that the movement is ordained by God, and that really anything goes, right? Even so far as the Constitution can be sort of put into brackets in order to achieve the movement's goals, right? One, I believe it was a historian I've read recently, said, watch out when politicians start talking about moralism, because bad things are on the horizon. One example that comes to mind recently, hasn't played out fully, but there was protests for Black Lives Matters in Washington, D.C., and the president had the protesters removed forcibly so that he could have the photo op, right, with the Bible in front of the church. And to me, that signals perhaps a testing of this idea of perhaps using moralism as a means to garner further support, to mobilize folks, and so forth. Why now? All right, we've talked about this, income inequality, the wealth gap, leaving behind of large numbers of people in middle America, tied to, I talked about this, neoliberal policies of privatization, outsourcing, et cetera, political polarization, gridlock, and policy failure. I talked about that as well. We have these big problems in the United States. Income inequality is one of them, and we'd like to solve it. But due to polarization, right? The polarization essentially, if you can imagine a continuum, right, from left to right, in the past, the two parties were aligned sort of toward the middle, and there was a good amount of overlap between them. They could negotiate, they could bargain, and they could come to agreement. With polarization, the two parties become more extreme, right? The Republicans move to the right, the Democrats move to the left, and that space for agreement, disappears and becomes much more difficult to pass, particularly bipartisan major landmark legislation that would address issues of income inequality and other major problems that we have in this country. That leads to gridlock, right, which leads to the appearance that the political system is unresponsive, and then the willingness of people to try something new, right? Mainstream politicians, this isn't working. Let's try, see what candidate Trump can do. Now, President Trump running for re-election. All right, last thing here real quick, I'll touch on these and then I'll see if there are any questions or observations out there. What's to be done, right, given this context? And I haven't touched on this yet. I started by talking about how populism is a social movement, right? People coming together to pursue goals that they share in common. But populism is also, or can be, dangerous, right? As I mentioned here, it can bring about liberal progressive reform, but it can also be harnessed as a base for an illiberal regime, right? A democracy without rights. A classic example, the fascist movement in Weimar, Germany, right, leading into Hitler, right, in World War II and things like this. Don't see that happening in the United States necessarily, but several European countries seem to be walking down that path, most notably, I would say, in Hungary, right, where the president has openly embraced that he is a leader of a now illiberal democracy, all right? The movement is what matters, and individual rights, minority rights, and things like this are no longer protected, right? Or at least not protected in the way they were before. So what's to be done? Defend liberal democratic institutions, right? We have separation of powers, checks and balances. President Trump has been checked by the legislature. He's been checked often by the courts, and those institutions seem to be holding up. Danger inherent there too, though, right, is that that very system of separation of powers and checks and balances is often viewed as an impediment to the goals of populist leaders and populist movements. So the temptation is to, throw out those restrictions, those limitations, and let's just do this thing, right? And that gets manifest in a number of the president's executive orders and things like this that then get challenged in court. They redo them, and many of them are now in effect in different ways. So defend the institutions, and I would say more self-government and less protest, right? I kind of struggled with this one, whether I should put this on here, but it makes a lot of sense to me, right? If you want to change the US political system for the better, to make it more responsive to the needs of the people, it seems to me that more of us, the ordinary people, should be filling offices, right? United States today, there's something like 500,000 elected positions across the states. Those are the elected positions, and then there's many, many more positions in the various bureaucracies. More Americans need to participate, right, and to take on the responsibility and burden of running for office, to not rely on legacy candidates and things like this, who may be seen to be out of touch or in the pockets of corporations and things like this. Protest is good, right? It's part of the democratic process, but it's not necessarily going to lead to major changes in the policies that populists are interested in. Just take income inequality, for example. If you want legislation to affect that, you have to get politicians in office who are willing to do that, or even talk about it in a constructive way. And again, protests may give sort of momentum and to help identify who those candidates are, to give them support and things like this. But ultimately, the halls of power, so to speak, need to be filled with allies who are willing to make these changes. And then lastly, probably the trickiest problem in our own time, I don't think we're going to solve it today, tomorrow, or even perhaps in our lifetimes, is this question of American national identity, right? What is it that ties us together, right? That makes us one nation. Increasingly, we're talking about diversity and pluralism and all of these different groups who sort of coexist within the U.S. political system, but there's no sense of real national unity. How can we craft a story, a narrative that will bring us all together, give us a common sense of belonging in a national community, right? To the degree that that is missing, we'll see more populism, we'll see more candidates like Donald Trump. All right, 2 minutes before 1. I'd love to hear thoughts or questions from anybody.
All right, who has a question for Dr. Berkenpas?
So,
Dr. Berkenpas, could you stop sharing
Yes.
so we can get a better view of people? Thank you.
so John, I'd like to I have a few comments.
Sure.
Josh, first of all, I just wanted to note that the themes that you applied to populism seem to be more true of populism on the right than on the left. There's some open room for discussion there, but that's just an observation. But my real question is, do you think populism and democracy can truly coexist? To me, it seems like a risky alliance.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was one of the things I'm working on is creating a sort of table that distinguishes populism on the left and the right. And I think you're correct to note that the features are from populism on the right, since we're focused on Trump and the election of 2016. So that is correct. Populism and democracy. From my perspective, democracy enables populism and vice versa, right? Populism is a democratic movement, right? It's people, right, not necessarily in the streets, but collectively as a movement, sort of pushing for change. Now, if we're talking about liberal democracy, right, this idea that individuals have rights and those rights are protected by government, that one of the purposes of government is to protect the rights of individuals and minorities against, right, the will of the majority, against the, as the Greek said, the demos, the people, the democratic majority in the country, then, right, they may seem to be incompatible, right? And in other countries around the world, you know, populism has essentially done away with that liberal part of democracy, and that's always the danger, that liberal democracy could turn into illiberal democracy, right? Where the sort of, you know, to go back to the framers, I call it the tyranny of the majority, right? Without any checks and balances or separation of power. So, good questions. Thank you.
Josh, I find this fascinating. In the rise of the populism surrounding Donald Trump, and also the rise in the populism surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement, and the conflict between those two populist movements, how do you see those two movements interacting, and the you know, collision of those movements?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, we're seeing all of these protests and these movements for change to reform the criminal justice system in the United States, to bring an end to a number of longstanding practices that discriminate against African Americans in this country. And I think it's, you know, I haven't put too much thought into it, but now that you mention it, it's interesting to think about Black Lives Matters as an example of populism on the left, right? It's a protest movement, social movement, pushing for change against a political system, or in this case, a criminal justice system that seems to be resistant to change, right? And non-responsive to the demands of a large segment of the population. Right? So pushing for change on the left, right? And everything I was talking about, the sort of dangers of populism, you know, I was talking mostly about populism on the right, but those dangers also exist for populism on the left, right? Had we been talking about a Bernie Sanders candidacy, you know, that those same dangers for liberal democracy exist, again, on the left and the right. It's an impatience with institutions, it's an impatience with checks and balances, separation of powers, and a willingness to bypass them in order to meet the movement's goals over and above the rights of minorities and individuals. So, good question.
We have time for one more question. Anybody have another question?
I'll ask one real quickly. I don't know if it's a quick answer, but it seems like populism on either side becomes an extreme that is damaging to the democracy itself. How can we start steering it back to the middle while maybe maintaining some of that populism?
Yeah, really good question. You know, in the past, the sort of mainstream politicians, if you will, the elites, if you will, you know, basically started listening, right, and hearing the populist demands for change. Populist Party emerged, you know, here in Minnesota and in neighboring states. They won some elections, particularly locally, and the Democrats and Republicans basically co-opted their planks, right? And we're seeing some of that, I think, on the Democratic side, with Biden apparently, you know, reluctantly adapting some planks to get the support of more populist candidates like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And of course, Donald Trump has tried to push forward a number of reforms that he promised during the campaign. But ultimately, you know, the political system has to respond, right? It has to address, politicians have to address income inequality, income insecurity, and find a way to, you know, pass legislation, bipartisan legislation that works, right? And part of the problem, I think, of course, is we have polarization, difficulty finding common ground. Part of the solution too is I don't think we have a solution at this point, right? We're in this conversation, and it's not entirely clear, you know, how the United States can address, in a practical sort of way, income inequality, right? Given the way the country has developed up until today.
All right. Dr. Berkenpas, thank you very much for being with us today. Let's give him a warm Kiwanis thanks. Thank you for being with us.
Yep, thank you so much for inviting me.
I would like to wish Corey a belated happy birthday, Corey Wheeler, and also welcome Jamil and Corey to our club. Thank you for joining. We look forward to a long membership and relationship with you guys here in our club. And with that, Doc, can you lead us in when Kiwanis calls?
When Kiwanis calls, when Kiwanis calls, let everyone stand up, stand up. When Kiwanis calls, when Kiwanis calls, let each one raise their cup, a cup, as we gather round the table. As long as we are able, we'll pledge to thee our loyalty. When Kiwanis calls.
Thanks, Doc. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great week. Hopefully, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.